Hello, everyone. In the wake of the recent shooting of the 8 people in Atlanta, of which 6 were Asian American, I wanted to do a video on the history of Asian American racism and why it's become more prevalent in the last year or so. If you would like to learn more about the history of Asian American racism and how to be an ally or donate, there's a link down in the description. Go check it out. You can find more info and ways to donate down there, and donating is a great way to support people in their time of need. But now, let's get started with the video then, shall we? When talking about Asian American racism, we have to remember that Asia is not just China, Japan, and Korea. Asia is a very, very, very big area, which of course includes China, Japan, and Korea, but also Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, Middle East, a lot of different people. So remember that it's not just a monolith. There's a lot of different cultures, a lot of different types of people that are included. Now, in the past year, there's been a rise in racism against Asian Americans. More than 1,800 racist incidents against Asian Americans were reported between March and May of 2020, according to the United Nations report. By late April, a coalition of Asian American groups that had created a reporting center called Stop AAPI Hate said it had received almost 1,500 reports of incidents of racism, hate speech, discrimination, and physical attacks against Asians and Asian Americans. So, yeah, it's not looking very good. In September, NYPD data showed that there had been a 1,900% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes in New York City in the past year. There were 20 incidents in the first half of 2020 alone, compared to one whole incident in 2019. So clearly, there is a rise in racism against Asian Americans within the last year. But before we talk why this has happened, let's talk about the history of Asian American racism in the United States, because it is not a new phenomenon. In 1880, the US enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned new Chinese immigrants and existing Chinese immigrants from becoming US citizens. This was a response to the fear of an Asian invasion and resentment of cheap labor coming from China over to the US. Then in 1892, the Geary Act amended the Chinese Exclusion Act, forcing all Chinese living in America to obtain and carry a government-issued residency identity card proving their legal status. Clearly a very racist legislation that targeted a specific ethnic minority. And this act lasted until 1943, so over 60 years that this lasted in America. Can you imagine? Then, in 1913, California barred aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning or leasing land. And of course, combined with the Chinese Exclusion Act, it, of course, would hit Chinese people pretty hard because they were barred from becoming citizens, and then they couldn't own land or lease land, so limiting their possibility of accruing wealth based solely on their ethnicity and nothing else. Then in 1917, the US signed into power the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, which imposed a literacy test on immigrants and barred immigration from the Asia-Pacific Zone. This is the Asiatic Barred Zone. So as you can see, it is a big chunk of the world that they basically said, nope, no thanks. Then in 1965, the racial part of this act was removed by the Immigration Act of the very same year. Then on February 19th in 1942, President Roosevelt ordered more than 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps, which operated until 1945. This was done as there was a fear due to World War II that was raging on, that Japanese Americans would be loyal or sympathetic to the Japanese homeland and would enact acts of terror on behalf, and they were kind of feared as being seen as sleeper agents waiting for the signal to, do terror, essentially. Now, remind you as well that most of the people that were sent to these internment camps were US citizens. So US citizens were being sent to concentration camps by the state for no other reason than their ethnicity, which is, of course, bad. It's very bad. It's a very bad thing to do. And I feel like this is oft overlooked in American history, that the US did this. And there are people still alive who lived through this. One very prominent figure who lived through this is George Takei, the actor. And he's spoken out about this very, very openly and campaigned and been an activist to bring more visibility to this topic. Then in 1982, Chinese-American Vincent Chin was beaten to death by two white men who blamed him for Japan's powerful auto industry and the US losing jobs to Japan, which of course is, extremely racist because Vincent Chin was Chinese, not Japanese. And of course it's racist because they're beating up someone who is American because of their ethnicity. And these men got sentences, but which were very lax. I don't think they went for jail even for one day. They were out on parole. And it sparked a civil rights movement among Asian American communities in the US. And of course, after 9/11, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs saw a rise in revengeance-motivated crimes against them. And then in 2003, there was an increase in discrimination towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders due to the SARS outbreak. So that's just a brief history of the racism that has existed in the United States on a federal legal level. And by legal, I mean like it's been put into acts and laws that the state has enacted. And going very far with this, as far as concentration camps, which the US is still doing at the border currently. So, hasn't changed that much now, has it? It's just a different ethnic group this time. Then, an important thing that I need to talk about here is the model minority myth. It's important to talk about this because this is a perception of Asian American people that harms the group as a whole. And it can be very insidious because this is one of those things that people can have this mindset of Asian American people and they don't really realize it. And it can do a lot of harm. So, what is the model minority myth? Well, the model minority myth is a myth that idolizes Asian American children as prodigies and geniuses while portraying their mother as a strict parent that pushes the child to work harder and be better than everyone else, while the father is nerdy and effeminate, holding a prestigious position, but not a leadership position, usually in STEM industries. So think to yourself, if someone were to mention an Asian kid, what are the first thoughts that come to your mind? Is it the model minority myth that, oh, they must be really good at math, oh, they must do a lot of extracurricular activity, they must be really good at school? That's the model minority myth. And this myth also characterizes Asian Americans as a polite, law-abiding group who have achieved a higher level of success than their general population through some combination of innate talent and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, immigrant striving. And of course, that is a story that Americans love, this can-do attitude, working hard and then making it. It's a great story, you know. But then why is it bad? Because you might think, well, you know, it's why is it bad? It portrays them as positive, right? They're very intelligent and they do well, and you know, why would that be a bad thing? The problem with it is that it erases the differences among individuals, meaning that if you don't fit this myth, it's very hard to find your place at all as an Asian American. Like, it portrays them as a very singular type of person, and if you don't fit that, then, you know, life is very difficult. Also, it ignores the diversity of Asian American cultures, because usually when you think of the model minority myth, you think China, Japan, Korea, but it ignores cultures like India, Taiwan, Samoa, Burma. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are a lot of different cultures within Asia, not just China, Japan, and Korea. And often this is paired with a desire to show how Asian Americans are doing so much better, but they only focus on certain Asian cultures. Usually the more affluent Asian families who come to the US from very affluent backgrounds, and as such have the money to study in very prestigious places. And again, wealth is heavily tied to the quality of education in the US, because in the public schooling sector in the United States, the amount of funding that a school gets is tied to the property taxing of its area. So if a school is in a rich area, it will get a lot of money from property taxing, whereas if school is in a poorer area, then there will be less funding. And if you look at other Asian American cultures, then we can see that it's not as well off doing as we want to portray it as. Then it perpetuates this idea that Asian Americans are perpetually foreign by viewing them as kind of exotic and other. You know, ooh, those Asian Americans, they just have something innately different about them that makes them so smart and hardworking, and views them as these different things, and makes it hard for them to be truly American and part of the society. And also it erases racism against Asian Americans by trying to show how well things are for them while ignoring the past that we just talked about. And it's an easy counter to bring, is like, well, what do you mean you're doing that poorly? Like, you're Asian, of course, like, you must be great at school, you must be doing really well at life, you know, all this kind of stuff. Well, it ignores your lived experience, and it ignores that history that we talked about. It's not good. And it makes the struggle for racial justice harder, because it's used often against other minorities to say that, look at the Asian Americans, they're doing so fine. If you just worked hard and were a go-getter, then you, the blacks, for example, could do well if you were just like the Asian Americans, who are a great minority. It can become a cudgel like that, which is super not great. All right, then, we've looked at the history of racism against Asian American people in the US and the model minority myth, but what is causing this rise in racism within the last year in the US? Well, you know, you might have noticed we are living through a pandemic currently, COVID-19, and the messaging around COVID-19 from the Trump administration wasn't great towards Asian Americans. So Trump and numerous members of his White House staff embraced racist and xenophobic anti-Asian rhetoric very early on in the pandemic, you know, calling it the China virus, the Wuhan virus, the Kung flu.
That name gets further and further away from China, as opposed to calling it the Chinese virus. I can name Kung flu,
as Trump referred to it, claiming that China sent the virus to destroy America. Like, these are very harming things for a leader of a country to say. And it normalizes a lot of racism. It shows to people that, you know, this type of behavior is acceptable, and that's very dangerous. Also, there was a 57-page memo by the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which included a talking point for politicians to argue that calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus isn't racist, which of course it is. There is, I think, the World Health Organization guideline that viruses should not be referred to by the location where they're discovered in, because it leads to this type of problem. And in July of last year, Trump claimed the Chinese government was fully responsible for concealing the virus and unleashing it upon the world. Like, this type of rhetoric is super dangerous, very racist, and it creates an atmosphere in which people are angry towards Asian Americans because they are seen as the scapegoats. Like, it's their fault. It's their country's fault. And that's why this rise in racism has been happening in the last year to Asian American and Pacific Islander people that we've seen. But of course, this is not unique to the United States. This has been happening in Europe as well. In Italy, the UK, France, Germany, Spain, Greece, for example. I'll probably do a segment on the Europe and how this has been happening across Europe. But just know that this is not unique to the US. And of course, you know, the US's history with Asian American racism makes it so that this is not a new thing, and it's something that the US government has done multiple times, so it's nothing new for them. But if you want to help fight this racism, which you should, I think, you should listen to Asian American and Pacific Islanders' experiences and believe them when they talk about them online, for example, or maybe they're your friends or your coworkers. You know, listen to them. Also, educate yourself on these topics, and don't expect your Asian American friends to do that for you. Don't go to them and be like, hey, teach me about everything, because that puts all the onus on the minority. It can be very, very tiring. Instead, educate yourself. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, you can find a link down in the description where you can educate yourself on stuff. Go through it. There's some great resources there. But you should reach out to your Asian American friends and colleagues to ask if there's anything that you can do to help with just like normal life stuff. You don't have to ask about how you can fix the racism in their life, because you can't. But you can ask them like, hey, is there anything I can do for you? Any practical things just to make their lives easier in these difficult times. And of course, if you see anything dangerous racism-wise happening live outside, if you see a racist incident, do intervene, but do it safely. There's in the resources that I mentioned, there's some guidelines there on how to intervene safely. Go through those. And of course, donate to organizations like Stop AAPI Hate and other organizations that are working to fight this racism. And again, link is down there. You can go check it out. There's links to donate there. All right. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you on the next one. Goodbye.